So over the next hour or so, Robert Harris and I will be talking about several of his novels, exploring how he brings history to life and what his work tells us not only about the past, but about the here and now. I think everyone can agree that historical novels are actually contemporary stories, and that history is usually a prism through which we can explore and examine our own times. Now, throughout a distinguished career in the media, which included working on Newsnight and Panorama, and as the Observer's political editor, Robert Harris always knew that novels were his destiny, and I think it's certainly clear that his best-selling debut, Fatherland, proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had found his métier. In years since, all his novels have earned exceptional reviews. They've topped the bestseller lists, and many of them have been turned into films and television programs. So this coming February, we'll see the Netflix premiere of Munich, starring Jeremy Irons as Neville Chamberlain, and there'll be a re-release of the novel to coincide. 2022 will also see the arrival of Sky Atlantic's adaptation of The Fear Index, and that stars Josh Hartnett. Another milestone of the past year was the release of Harris's Cicero trilogy as a single volume, and it presents the saga of ancient Roman politics as a seamless, and I have to tell you, riveting read. So in keeping with some of the themes of the festival, Robert and I will talk around several of his novels. We'll delve into ideas around power, religion, authority, and how the past informs our present and our future. And there'll be time for you to ask questions. There'll be a roving mic, so be sure to let them fizz away while he and I are talking. So welcome, Robert. It's lovely to see you again. Hello, hello, hello. Now, whenever I read interviews with you, whenever you're talking, it always comes out that power is the subject that fascinates you. And what I'm really curious to know is what makes certain ideas and certain historical incidents irresistible to you? How do you know that's my book?
Well, it's normally a situation and a character, really, and you never can tell what it's going to be. You might see a line on social media, or usually just simple curiosity, actually. I'm fortunate, really, as I get on in my career, in that I've always looked outwards, as it were, rather than inwards. I haven't exhausted writing about myself. As I was a journalist, you know, the world, especially as it doesn't even have to be contemporary, offers any number of stories. Although obviously sometimes I make novels up completely that bear no relation to historical events. But I think what one looks for, as you said earlier, no historical novel is really a historical novel. They're all contemporary novels, but using the backdrop of history. And history is a great thing to be writing because it's very hard to get a grip on the modern world. And so many of the techniques of fiction, discovery, for instance, the gumshoe detective, they're completely short-circuited by the modern internet age. So it's good to go and write novels where people can't look something up on Google. I mean, imagine Pride and Prejudice. Mrs. Bennet would have known who'd moved into the hall down the road within about 35 seconds.
Yes, and imagine if somebody in dire straits in one of your books could just make a quick mobile phone call and get rescued.
Hell. I mean, all the visits to libraries, all that sort of stuff. It's, at least in a historical novel, people could still do all that.
Well, those are some of the freedoms of a historical novel, but are there constraints? Are there constraints upon you when you work in a historical way?
Well, yes, there are a lot of constraints. One of them is obviously simply getting a person from one place to another often requires a lot of research. How they get there, what they'd see, what they'd be wearing. In a way, you don't have to do that with a contemporary novel. On the other hand, that is in itself fascinating and gives a book texture. I suppose the biggest problem is just leaving stuff out and trying to find the essence of the story that connects everything, and not getting bogged down in research. You've really got to throw your research away. You refer to the Cicero trilogy, which I see next to you. That's about 450,000 words. The actual research file for those novels is 500,000 words. It's actually larger than that huge tome. So, you have to know everything, and then you have to kind of forget it, really.
Well, because the classic danger of a historical novel is what we call the info dump, right? I learned all these facts, and you're going to read about them as well.
Yes, I always think when I was writing the Cicero books and also Pompeii, I thought my model was, if I was having a character walk from, say, Marble Arch to Bond Street, I wouldn't say they walked along Oxford Street and past the department store known as Selfridges, founded by Gordon Selfridge in 1910, which boasted the world's first escalator. I'd just say they walked down Oxford Street, past Selfridges, and turned right. Yeah. You have to forget it. Tom Stoppard has a great phrase, which he pins up next to his computer, which is simply, just because it's true doesn't mean it's interesting.
And that's very accurate. I thought maybe, I told you earlier I'd read around quite a few of the books, and I thought maybe we could start with Conclave, because I was so gripped by that. I was so gripped by this election, the cardinals gathering to elect the new pope. I was also delighted that I'm not a cardinal, because the voting process seemed like it was so, the book was not tedious, but the voting process seemed like it must be so ritualized and so samey over and over and over again. You have said that it's a subversive novel, and you've also said that a complete atheist could not have written it. And I wondered if you could unpack those ideas for our audience tonight.
Sorry, what was the first point? The atheist, and what was the other point you made?
Subversive, that you said it was a subversive novel.
Yes. Well, it's subversive. Well, let me put it this way, really. The great trick, I think the key to that book was when I decided to tell it from the point of view of the Dean of the College of Cardinals, the man who actually ran the election, rather than, as I often do, some more minor figure. And by doing that, and especially by giving him a crisis of faith at the same time as he's elected Christ, God's representative on earth, it meant that the novel is kind of lit from within about the Catholic Church. It's not an agnostic journalist, political journalist writing it from outside. I tried to make an imaginative, empathetic leap into what it must be like to be inside the whole thing. So to that extent, a friend of mine said it's a very friendly novel, and in a way it is. It's sort of, not nasty about the Catholic Church. It is, however, subversive to the extent that I go inside the most sacred ritual of a faith that has more than 1 billion adherents in the world, and as anyone who's read through to the end of the novel knows, it tackles something about the Catholic Church which I find very anomalous in the modern world. That is its attitude to women and the ability of women to hold any significant office within the church. So it's subversive to that extent. And as for the atheism point, I think if you're a novelist, you can't close your eyes to anything. I mean, you have to be a little bit good, a little bit evil. You have to understand why the Nazis had come to power. You have to be a receptor, as it were, to all sorts of ideas. And I'm certainly receptive to the idea that all cannot simply be explained by science, and that probably no more than that. But if even Einstein was prepared to accept that there might be something beyond what he knew, I think that most of the rest of us should probably do the same.
We'll probably come back to this when we discuss one of the other books, but there is that idea. A lot of people think it's very cut and dry, that there's either science or there's God. And in fact, as you say, many scientists have faith. And many scientists have a God. Robin Ince has written a new book about the importance, it's called The Importance of Being Interested. It's about scientific curiosity. And he says that science doesn't so much disprove God as give God a lot less to do. I wonder if you'd...
Good point.
Yeah. But they don't cancel each other out.
No, of course not. I think that... the novel that you mentioned earlier, The Fear Index, I visited CERN and saw the Large Hadron Collider and so on. It's answering huge questions about the origin of the universe, but it doesn't it cannot answer the question why. Mm-hmm. It can only answer the question what. And another common feature of all my books, I think, is I have a great dislike of certainty, either in a politician or in a theologian. And almost the passage of writing that I'm most proud of, in a funny way, if I'm allowed to say that, is the homily that's delivered by Cardinal Lamelli in Conclave just before the election for the Pope starts, where he says the great enemy of faith is certainty, because without doubt, there's no need for faith if it was simply science. And I think that faith is a great, we have a need for something that is faith, that isn't something that isn't certain. And so, those are the kind of issues that do fascinate me, because I'm interested in power and what moves men and women and the structures around us. That fascinates me. And you can't really write about that without writing about the great religious faith.
No, but could you have written a similar book about any other religion, do you think?
Well, if I tried to write that novel about Islam, I might have got into a lot of trouble. And in fact, I would imagine if I tried to go inside the most sacred rituals of Islam and write a subversive book, it's possible no one would have cared, but it's also possible that my publishers might not have taken it, or it might have been denounced in quite a lot of papers, and I could have been in trouble. And there was a time when I was writing that novel, when I was thinking, my God, this is freedom, this is what we fought for, that I could sit here and write this book about a faith with 1.25 billion followers, or however many it is, and no one will trouble me, no one will criticize me for it, there won't be any threat. And I thought that was a tribute to the society we created. But I could have written it about the Church of England, but the election of the choosing of Archbishop of Canterbury, but frankly, I don't think anyone would have been interested.
I wanted to also ask you, I know you read the Gospels as part of your research, and I'm just wondering, do you have any comments on them as literature, as pieces of literature? Well,
yes, they're thrillers, actually. When I read them fast, quickly, and it's a great narrative story of, particularly when Christ knows that he's going to face almost certain death, and early on the followers sort of fanning out across the country. It has an extraordinary narrative arc, and if you talk about subversive, and that's more the Gospels are more subversive than anything I could ever come up with. It's such that I hadn't appreciated. I recommend to anyone to read them through quickly, because you do get a sense of story, and you do get a sense of revolutionary impulse, the most revolutionary movement, and the fact that it then ended up encased in the Vatican and in all the rituals and the pomp and the rest of it is one of the great paradoxes of the age.
Well, Christianity its growth is a remarkable success story. And I often stop to think about what made it so successful, what brought it from its tiny origin to what we have now.
Well, that's a question probably really beyond me. It synthesized quite a lot of religions. It offered obviously the promise of eternal life if you could put up with the wretchedness of your current existence. it said, you know, that you could be humble, but you could still take your place in heaven. So it offered, as it were, quite a good prospectus as people realized how miserable and difficult life was, how many children died in infancy, how short lives were. It offered an explanation for all of that. And I can see its appeal. And also it is a revolutionary message. And it must have been electrifying at the time when it was first heard.
Before I move away from Conclave, I want to talk about you've talked about how interesting the slowness of the papal vote is, and how you actually think that democracy would benefit from slowing down. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, whatever else you may say, the Catholic Church has been an incredibly successful institution, and for 500 years, or however long it is, it's been been following this ritual of elections, and by locking everyone up together, and by a constant, as you say, repetition of prayer and casting ballots and talking. Which is very interesting, because it is like a bit more like a political convention, and I think that they sometimes like to let on. They look one another in the eye, and they come to a kind of collective wisdom, and by and large it's been pretty successful. And I think it is a good test. And one of the developments of modern politics, which, you know, I've found to my surprise has been least effective, has been widening the franchise in the various political parties to one member, one vote, because it's thrown up quite a lot of leaders who aren't really in touch, who aren't very effective. We had better leaders, I think, at the time when the vote was restricted to the MPs who actually saw them. And I think that the conclave process is a very good winnowing out of who will work and who won't, and who can hold the thing together and who's just going to create factions. So, I mean, I think there's a great wisdom in that particular institution.
In a way, though, it also condenses the whole electioneering element of it. One thing I think about modern politics, and one thing that kept striking me in the Cicero trilogy, was there seemed to be this nonstop jockeying for position and campaigning, and I found myself thinking, well, when do they actually do the governing part? They seem to be always trying to elect each other all the time, and I find that when I look at modern politics as well. I don't know if that resonates with you.
Oh, yes, it does, absolutely. No sooner does one election end than the business of getting ready for the next begins, especially in the United States. And in fact, I think there's a line in the Cicero trilogy. There are so many votes in Rome. I mean, you voted for all the magistrates, you voted for the consuls, you voted for the judges, you voted for the people who ran the roads, you voted for the people who ran the aqueducts, you voted for the people who held the games, you voted for the people who kept the streets clean. And someone says, you know, there's so much democracy. We died of a surfeit of democracy. I mean, there was just votes and votes and votes all the time. So yeah, I think that that's a good point.
And you said that you had seen, when you thought about the conclave of cardinals and you thought about the Roman senators, you could see a kind of a visual parallel between them, couldn't you?
Yes, when it was when Pope John Paul died, I watched the announcement of the election of his successor. And I was writing the Cicero books, and as described in Conclave, when a new pope is elected, they move from the Sistine Chapel and follow the new pontiff, and they gather at the windows on this long gallery where I went actually before he steps out onto the balcony. His identity is revealed, and the faces clustering at the window. Old men, shrewd, some of them unworldly, others some fat, some thin and aesthetic. I thought, my God, when I was watching it, that is the Roman Senate. This is completely what I'm seeing. And at that point, that was when the idea for the book started to germinate, because I thought there must be something behind this. What is the process by which this happens? And literally the day that I finished Dictator, the last of the Cicero books, I started researching conclaves. And by the end of the first morning, it was clear to me that I'd found almost my perfect subject, actually. Enclosed space, 120 people, and frankly, quite a lot of jockeying for position and switching of votes, and yet all of it cloaked in language. There's nothing better for a writer than when people are saying dialogue when they actually mean the complete opposite, or something different. And all those elements were there. And of course, it's elections, which I love, elections. So it was a very happy time, and I loved writing that book. And in many ways, I would say it's one of my two of my books that I'm most fond of.
Well, I found it very difficult to put down. I was like, what's going to happen next? What will they vote for next? So hats off to you there. You said something very interesting. You said dictating. You dictate your books? Like Henry James?
No, sorry, Dictator, the last volume of the Cicero trilogy. I didn't finish dictating the novel. I finished Dictator. I couldn't dictate a novel. I'd find it very hard. I'd like to work on the page and change things, and I need to see it, really.
Yeah. If I move on to The Second Sleep, your protagonist in that is a priest, and we meet him en route to conduct a funeral in a remote village. And in the great tradition of storytelling, he is the classic, the stranger arrives in a small town and disrupts everything. It always works. It's a brilliant way to throw that stone into the pool and watch the ripples move out. In this book, society has reset the clock, and now the church has taken advantage of all the ignorance and opacity to promote a doomsday scenario, saying that the bad things that happened were brought about by God's displeasure. And I kept thinking, when you control the knowledge, you control the populace, don't you?
Yes, completely. I suppose one of the things that I feel is that we are, as human beings, caught in an endless loop, really. And for the last 2,000 years or so, certainly since the Roman Republic, the same things just recur, actually. Power shifts. 1 year, 1 century, you have a kind of democracy, and then for centuries it disappears, then it comes back again. And everything is cyclical. At the moment, apart from, certain religions, obviously Islam does have enormous political power, but at the moment, the religious faiths in the West, although much followed, they don't have real political power. But that may well change. No one would have predicted. One of my favorite letters ever written to an author was written by Evelyn Waugh to George Orwell when he read for the first time 1984, and he said, dear Mr. Orwell, your book is very powerful, but you've made one huge mistake, if I may say so. You completely ignore the church. Forget about its supernatural elements, if you will, but as an institution, I cannot believe it would have completely died out in the way it does in your novel. And of course, Waugh was correct about that, because it was the church in Poland and that was to really spark a huge political change. So I think that we are by no means done with faith, which of course some people would say is just irrational superstition, but we live in an age of irrationalism now. And I wanted to try and address that. So when I cast my mind into the far future, I thought that it would probably look like the far past. If you took away science and all the things that make our modern world, we'd just simply revert back to needing faith to explain the world and what had happened.
I thought that one of the messages I was hearing, and again, every reader reads their own book, don't they, was that society has a tendency to look for a parental figure, that when your back's to the wall and everything's horrible, you look for the father figure, or the mother figure, and that for me in that novel, that's what the church became. It's like, okay, we'll look after you, but you have to obey our rules now.
Yes, I think that that's very true. And the big figure, the big boss figure, seems to be making something of a comeback when you look across the world at what's happening in China, obviously what's happened in Russia, what happened in America when Trump was in power, to some degree perhaps, what's happened here. You know, people like that strong figure, and they are less interested nowadays in political parties. And so the effects of social media, which are colossal and which are so present and all around us and fast moving that I don't think any writer can really get a hold on it. It's having profound effects on the way that we think and the structures of power. And I don't think we've even begun to scratch the surface of it, and none of it, in my view, is going to be a liberal democracy. I fear that we may be moving out of a kind of golden age, a kind of Antonine age, if you like, and into something much more totalitarian and much more frightening in many ways.
Well, I think social media, to me, seems to be eliminating all the shades of gray. It seems to be doing exactly what you spoke about earlier, which is insisting on certainty.
Yes, I mean, if I have a guiding principle, or why I write novels from the Roman era, or to novels set in the future, or set in 19th century Paris or whatever, it's that fundamentally human beings don't change much from decade or century to century. It's like a quantity theory that I have. Forgive me, these percentages won't add up, but I think you can maybe say there's 5% of hugely talented people, and there's 35 to 40% of pretty nice, decent people, and there's maybe 30% of not that nice people, and maybe there's 10% of kind of psychopaths. And the important thing in this society is to keep the psychopaths out. And sometimes that doesn't happen. In Germany in the 1930s, and in Rome when the Republic fell. And it seems to me that social media empowers the 30% who are, and you see it. This is roughly the percentage that voted for the Nazis, and that is quite susceptible to following the big man. And I really think that social media is a threat to these sort of establishment controls, if you like. I mean, let's face it, that have kept a lid on quite a lot of things which were not supposed to be spoken of in polite society. There were gatekeepers that prevented that happening. Now the gates have been flung wide open. Anyone can say anything. Any conspiracy theory can be floated. And you feel as though banks that had controlled passions have been blown away with an incoming rushing sea. And a democracy that can decide something 51 to 49, or dare I say it, 52-48, and can completely swing around and deride anyone who voted the other way. There's something wrong there.
You also talked about, now in Conclave, one of the lines was, how can a church be universal if it speaks 50 languages, which I thought was really interesting. But in The Second Sleep, one of the things, in addition to negating science and saying that doesn't work anymore, we're not talking about it, they also control the language. They reduce the language to just what's in the Bible. And I thought that was so interesting. Why did you go in that direction with it?
Well, one of the books that's most influenced me in my life is 1984, which I mentioned earlier. And of course, Orwell's brilliant insight was that who controls the past controls the present and the future, that's true. But who controls the language can control thought and therefore manipulate the present. And it seemed to me that in my dystopian society of the future, there would have to be control of the language. And as a novelist, it suited me fine to write a book in which I think virtually no word is, certainly in dialogue, is spoken that isn't in the King James Version, that they have, and that this outlaws any thought of science, any thought of anything that's beyond kind of 1600. You can't really think it because the language doesn't exist to describe it. And that I thought would be quite an interesting play on Newspeak. And so my characters they all talk old speak, if you like, and it controls, limits what they can think about.
And of course, you are often, I won't say accused, you're often, people think that you're psychic because you write books set in the past that speak to the future. One of the problems with the society in this book is the breakdown of the supply chain.
Well, yes, I mean, I've been obsessed with that for nearly 20 years, ever since that, or indeed, yes, 20 years, ever since that tanker drivers dispute in 2000, when I live in the country, and you suddenly saw the queues outside the filling stations, and, you know, you couldn't take the children to school, and the supermarket shelves were emptying. And then 8 years after that, we had the financial crash, where there was a serious worry at one point that the ATMs might run out of money, the banks would fold. And then it was then that you started to hear this phrase that London is only 6 meals away from starvation. There is no food in London, really. There's no great reservoir of food. It's all on lorries, you know, coming in, endlessly moving around the country. So we live in a highly technologically advanced civilization that is, in my view, highly vulnerable to disruption, especially when there are state players, state agencies, as well as terrorists, who are trying to find ways to crash the whole system. And you could do more damage with a cyber attack than the whole of the Luftwaffe bombing campaign against London in the Second World War. So, you know, that is an area of vulnerability I wanted to address, that we have, all of us. I mean, my father, who was born in the 1920s, he knew how to take a car apart, engine apart, and put it back together again. I mean, almost no one could do that now. The cars are electronic. You've lost control, really, of, the world is so sophisticated now, one can no longer control it. And as we've seen with these unfortunate people who've lost power over the last week, one of the worst things is losing the ability to charge mobile phones and losing access to the internet and so on. You just feel blind in the modern world.
Especially now with the pandemic on top of that, because so many people, that's the only way they can get their jobs done. Because so few of us actually make anything physically anymore. Most of us spend a lot of the time looking at screens and doing our work that way.
Yes, I don't want to sound, incidentally, like a Luddite. I fear I do. I mean, one of the reasons I've been able to increase my output as a novelist is because of the fantastic research tool that is provided by the internet now. Books which would have taken a year or more to research, you can do it as you come to a scene. You can look up what you want to know. And if you can imagine going through the pandemic, the lockdowns, without Zoom, without the ability for families to talk to one another, people stranded abroad as they are at the beginning of the second sleep, you know, we would have been lost without it. You know, there are huge upsides to the technological revolution, but as with everything, you know, the great upsides come with equally sized downsides, and it's those we've got to watch.
Let me shift tack a little bit and ask you, you've been both in your work and in your previous work, you've been very close to politics and politicians. I'm wondering, and this totally relates to the books, how difficult you think it is to retain one's morality as one's power increases. Cicero, for all of his noble ideas, seemed to me to have a sliding scale. There were things he would do because they would move him around. And in a way, this also connects to Munich because you've written a very sympathetic portrait of Chamberlain. One reviewer even said it's a book about an honorable man longing for peace, facing a dishonorable man with a contempt for those intentions. So does power corrupt? Absolutely.
Yes, is the short answer to that. And almost every political leader, after 5 or 6 years in office, starts to part company with reality, let alone morality. And you see that time and again. We've seen that in our lifetimes, obviously. I think Mrs. Thatcher, by the third term, was parting company with reality. I think Tony Blair, possibly even earlier, actually. And I'm not sure that it's possible to get around that. I mean, the Americans are very wise to limit presidents to 8 years, because beyond 8 years, I think you're isolated and you are living in an echo chamber, and things start to go wrong as a result. I have, rather as I try to write about the Catholic Church with sympathy, my basic position with politicians is actually one of sympathy rather than they're all scoundrels. So that was how I felt about Cicero, who seemed to me to be a sort of compassionate and broadly decent man, who nevertheless to rise had to be very wily. And if you're ambitious, you're also, let's face it, pretty selfish. But on the whole, someone has to do these jobs. I wouldn't want to try and fix the health service right now. I wouldn't like to spend my time trying to work out social care in the future. I'm glad that other people do it. And I think one has to give them some credit for that. And as for Chamberlain, yes, he's almost the supreme example for me of someone who was essentially decent. I speak a little from, not experience, but I grew up in a council house originally in Nottingham. It was built in the 30s when Chamberlain was Minister of Housing. And he built an enormous number of council houses, and they all had indoor sanitation and so on. And this sort of municipal, gas and water politics that he practiced, he was a decent man who did a lot. And actually, his work as Chancellor of the Exchequer held the British economy together better than most other countries, and indeed provided the amount of money which enabled us to rearm with spectacular success. In 1939, say, we were spending 50% of all tax revenue on armaments, and the currency was stable enough that we could borrow money abroad. So these are unsung virtues, but nevertheless, they were quite important. And I just felt that he's had a hard time. Unfair time. He died in 1940, and he was a convenient scapegoat for everyone, for the Conservatives who were now backing Churchill, and for, in particular, in many ways, the Labour Party, who voted against every measure of rearmament that Chamberlain ever tried to introduce. So it seemed to me that he was crying out for revision. And the great thing about writing a novel is that you can create characters and you can go into a world, because it's like you switch on more lights for a reader. They become emotionally engaged rather than simply, reading it as something that is interesting. But so I think that's the argument for fiction, historical fiction, and it does make it possible to try and show someone sympathetically who hasn't been so viewed in the past.
And have you been involved in the upcoming television series? I think getting Jeremy Irons for Chamberlain is going to be fantastic.
Well, I was involved, yes, because oddly enough, I met Jeremy after Conclave came out, because it was thought that he might play the central cardinal in that. I know him from old, and he's a friend, and then I said, I looked at him and I thought, my God, you are Neville Chamberlain. You're a handsomer version. I agreed, but the bone structure and so on. So I said, I'm writing this novel about Neville Chamberlain. Would you be interested in that? And he said, oh, God, yes, do please send it. Because actors like to play prime ministers or something like that. So I sent it to him before it was published, and immediately he said he'd like to do it. So he's been attached to this project right from the start, and it headlines the film, in a way. It anchors it. It says, this is, Chamberlain normally is played by some wispy little character, actor, or he's portrayed in that way, I should say. I mean, most notably in Darkest Hour, that Churchill Farrago that came out the other year. And so if you have a big actor, double Oscar winner, handsome, imposing, playing Chamberlain, immediately everything looks different. I mean, Chamberlain himself was a slight figure and rather a shy man, but he was a dominating man. I mean, he really controlled British politics for several years. And he was a dynamic figure at the time of Munich. I mean, Munich only happened because of Neville Chamberlain. He was relentless in his desire to try and stop a war. And just as Hitler was relentless in his desire to try and start a war. And in the end, for a time, Chamberlain prevailed. He stopped the war starting in 1938, which Hitler, till the end of his life, said was one of his gravest mistakes was not to have gone to war over Czechoslovakia in 1938. It was a much better issue to fight on. So, I've enjoyed doing that book, and I suspect the film, when it comes out, will cause a little trouble, but that's good, isn't it? I think one of the jobs of the writer is to cause a bit of trouble.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I said before, you throw that rock into the pond and start those ripples going.
Yes, it's funny, I went to the screening of the movie at the London Film Festival. There's hundreds of people watching, and there's Jeremy Irons up playing Neville Chamberlain. And I felt within myself the kind of subversive 13, 14-year-old boy who used to edit the school newspaper. Only now I've been able to do it at a cost of tens of millions of dollars. And I've never really lost that instinct.
Brilliant. I'm going to circle back a bit because, again, we were talking about the corrupting nature of power. To me, what I see sometimes, and it happens in ancient Rome and it happens in contemporary Westminster, is when people in power start to believe that they are messiahs. They become messianic figures in their own heads. They think that they have qualities, godlikeness. And I find that to be an extremely dangerous thing in politicians. And again, it shows up in your novels as well.
Yes, I mean, you have to bear in mind that people who rise to the top, they differ from most of the rest of us. They have a single-mindedness and a hunger for power that is quite alien to me. I mean, I'm quite ambitious in what I've done in my life, obviously, and worked quite hard, but I've never had any desire to boss anyone around at all. And indeed, I don't employ a secretary even, or a researcher. I've never employed a researcher. I like to do everything myself. So this idea of wanting to control a whole country is one that I find strange from the start. So you're attracting, I talked about the quantity theory of people that are attracted. You're quite likely to attract some strange people before you even get started. And really the story of the Cicero books is the need to, I mean, power is like, in a sense, a radioactive material. And it has to be encased in lead, divided up, held at a distance. And the Roman system was very good at this because it divided, there were two consuls, one January, one February, one March, one April, alternating. And you had all the heads of the courts as well. And so power was divided, and it was annual elections and so on. And it was quite effective in that way. And that's very important. You need some means of controlling people, because otherwise things can quickly become corrupt. The importance to me of An Officer and a Spy, the Dreyfus novel, is not so much the anti-Semitism, appalling though that was, and obviously that's a central feature of the book, but it was the ability of the institution of the French army, and in the end the French government, to lie and cover up quite decent people doing it because they felt this was in the greater interests of the French army and of the French nation. They convinced themselves of that, and they were willing to lie and possibly even carry out murder, because they felt that they were validated. And if only there had been openness at Dreyfus's trial, initial court-martial, none of it would have happened. So one of the most important lessons I always take is to spread power and also to make the exercise of power visible. I mean, it may slow things up and it may be very fractious, but it's the opposite of the big man kind of crony politics, which we seem increasingly now to be seeing across the world.
Well, very definitely. In terms of the Cicero trilogy, can you talk at all about the religion of the time? Strikes me as it felt like it had a lot of superstition. You know, we have to pay homage to our gods, we have to make sacrifices, we have to be sure to do thus and so before we can move forward. Can you talk a little bit about how that interwove with the politics of that era?
Well, you know, religion and politics were entwined, and a lot of the Catholic Church, Pontifex Maximus and so on, a lot of the, it's no wonder that I thought that the Senate looked like the Curia, because they're the same, really. I mean, the institution, the Roman Empire kind of sailed on in the arc of the Catholic Church to some degree. So, yes, there's a state religion, and to be Pontifex Maximus, famously Caesar got the job very young, and it put him at the center of power and really paved the way for his rise to power. I think the biggest difference between religion then, excuse me, and now, is that it was really more about the ritual than any particular faith. And it was very superstitious. And there was no, as you say, and there was no real morality to it. I mean, you didn't have to believe any of this old cobblers, but you had to get it right. You had to recite the prayer correctly and sacrifice the animal correctly and inspect the entrails correctly. And if you started to get it wrong, you had to go back and start all over again. And if you fell over, or people were always looking for omens or signs, you know, everything had a spirit, everything was kind of alive. So it's, you know, it's very, very different to Christian morality. There's really no conscience in Roman religion, and that's why they'd found no difficulty in the most horrendous executions, tortures. You know, it wouldn't even have occurred to them. It was only, and partly because of Cicero, this idea of what was a good life, not meaning you know, kind of holidays and so on. The good life meaning the honorable life, that he started to popularize the Greek ideas of how do we live a good life. The way that we don't fear death is to have lived a good life. And so there you start to see in Cicero and his philosophy the beginnings, really, of a kind of Christian idea of humanism, the importance of being decent and kind and not cruel, and that this was a path to happiness and to a kind of immortality.
In a way that draws us all the way back to Conclave, where we have characters who are trying to make a massive decision on the basis of their faith as much as anything else, and trying to say, what is the right decision for our church? What is the right decision for humanity?
Yes, and where is the division between personal ambition and faith in a guiding hand? I mean, you know, I suppose a lot of my writing is I'm trying to get back to the essence of something. You know, the Cicero books, rather than inventing the prime minister and making it a parochial Westminster book or an imaginary president even, if you write about the Roman politics, the Roman Republic, Cicero, Caesar, Crassus, Cato, you universalize politics. And really writing about Conclave, writing about the election of a pope, really, you know, you take 1.25 billion people, you take this earth-shattering history of religion, and you put it into one room, and this group of people locked up and having to make a decision. And this is the ultimate expression, really. Someone said balance between the sacred and the profane, balance between the mortal and the immortal. On this fulcrum, a conclave operates. So for me, it's almost like Cicero, it's the ultimate opportunity to write about power, really, and what it is and who wants it, and why the people who want it most are the ones you should be most suspicious of.
I have to say that when I got to the end of the Cicero trilogy, I was a little bit chilled to the core, because what I took away from it was that the Republic got taken over by rich and unscrupulous people who basically destroyed democracy for a rather long time. Is that a fair reading?
Yes, I'd written an introduction to the new edition. I mean, I'd always wanted to see the book as the three books together, like a kind of Lord of the Rings, if you like, without furry feet. And I look back over the books, and I'm not blowing my own trumpet here at all, because I simply followed the historical story as closely as I could, and it was much more pertinent now than it was when it was first published in the individual volumes, because really what it's about, and I didn't recognize this pattern in the carpet or the mosaic until long afterwards, is it's about the collapse of faith in the elite, and it's about unscrupulous members of that same elite hypocritically siding with the masses for unscrupulous ends to bring down their own class, as it were. And it touches on the fact that somehow, strangely, societies seem to divide 50-50. I don't know why that is, but it is the case. And it was certainly the case in ancient Rome, or the Roman Republic, that there was no clear view as to what the Republic existed for. And once the consensus started to go in this welter of populism, then the whole institution began to collapse. I mean, there were other reasons as well, of course. Rome became a huge military power, so suddenly there were standing armies, countries were being conquered, so huge sums of money were flowing into private hands to corrupt elections. That also took place. I mean, they were endlessly debating campaign reform in ancient Rome, and politics got bogged down for months, even years, in the courts as one side battled another. The parallels with today were startling. I mean, and I'm not making this stuff up. No. I mean, this is what happened.
Yeah. Well, history does tend to repeat itself. I'm down to my last few questions, so before I approach those, I just want to see if anyone in the room has a question for Robert. We do have a roving mic. Just raise. Oh, okay. So we're going to take a question from the audience. The mic is coming. Just be sure to hold it right up to your mouth.
Hi, Robert.
Hi.
Hi there. During lockdown, I started reading your books, courtesy of my wife. And towards the end of lockdown, I heard you in an interview with, I think it was Dan Snow, talking about V2. And how quickly you wrote that. Was that, I think my memory is correct. So basically V2, you'd written that throughout the first lockdown, would that be right?
Yes, I mean, my ideal working time is to start a book in mid-January and finish it in mid-June. I mean, I will have spent the 6 months before that thinking about the book and the characters and researching it and so on. But I was a journalist, as Lee said at the beginning, and I was a columnist on the Sunday Times and on the Daily Telegraph, and the essence was, you just had to fill the space, and it didn't have to be good, it just had to be there. And that is good training, or at least it helped me, because first of all, it removes a bit of the mystique from writing and the endless desire to procrastinate and not to start. You have to do it. So I like to give myself 6 months. The publishers know what the book's called. They're already designing the cover and the rest of it. And the translators actually in Germany and Italy are also starting to translate it as I write. And I just go on and run at it. And what that does is give you an adrenaline rush, I think, that means that you see things that you wouldn't otherwise see. When I was a columnist, the worst, limpest columns were always the ones I prepared, researched, took a long time preparing. The ones that flew off the page were the ones that you just wrote in a panic in an hour and a half. It was like going on and doing a turn as a comedic stand-up. To a degree, I think that works for me with writing novels. And what I do is work in the mornings, and then in the afternoons relax and take the dog for a walk or see a friend for lunch or whatever. And that second part is very important in the creative process. It's the recreation process, if you like, that enables you to wake up the next day with fresh ideas. And the trouble with lockdown is that I'd started my normal beginning of the book in January. I'd written about a quarter of it when suddenly Armageddon hit us all. And I could no longer have the recreation bit of the day. And also, I thought, well, who the hell is going to be interested in a novel about the V2, for God's sake, this autumn? So I thought the whole thing, I'd just leave it. But my publishers were still very keen to have it, and I had a contract. So I had to really force the book out of myself. And there's something in the quality of the writing of it, I think, which shows. I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying that there's a tautness to it, and a machine-like precision in a way with the plot, cutting back and forth. That is a product of lockdown, I think. God, I hope to God we don't go into another one.
No, indeed. But
We have a question over here.
Thank you for a fascinating series of insights this evening. Is it possible, do you think, to conceive of somebody with an authentic, deep faith who also seeks to hold power over millions of people because they think that that is a good thing to do?
Well, I suppose that has quite often happened. I mean, I'm skeptical about the idea that all the people that rise to hugely powerful positions in whatever church are like Chauncey Gardiner, in that Peter Sellers film, being there. They just happen to have stumbled into it. That was certainly the case with Pope John Paul II. I think that obviously it was a catastrophe, personal catastrophe for him to find himself suddenly Pope. But by and large, I think quite a lot of these leaders do feel that they can do it and want to do it. And I don't think most of them do sort of stumble into it by accident. I think that they want it. Pope John Paul II, I'm getting my John Pauls confused. Obviously, I meant John Paul I for the one who didn't want to do it. And John Paul II, who I think a lot of his people around him felt that he wanted it. He knew he could be a huge agent of historical, epochal change. And, that's fine. I mean, you have to have a certain character to do the job well. And one of the things about the cardinals, yes, when you see them all together, they look elderly and otherworldly, some of them. But actually, the average cardinal has maybe 70 million people, in their flock. They are significant political players, often in South America and in the East. And they are wily, they're sophisticated, and they're highly intelligent. They speak a lot of languages, they're very well read. I mean, these are formidable guys, to have got to be a cardinal. You've got to a very, very high level. So to then all get together and choose the supreme one out of all of that, that is a pretty impressive electoral system, and I'm not surprised they haven't changed it.
But is there a secular equivalent? Is there a secular, I don't know if I'm misinterpreting your question, but I'm wondering if there's a secular equivalent of a person with this intense amount of faith who also wants to be politically dominant.
I think that most politicians, if they're any good, will want to dominate, will think that they can do the job. The great prime ministers, Churchill, Thatcher, Gladstone, Lloyd George, the big figures, all of them were confident in the job, all thought they could do it, all wanted it, and You know, I mean, a lot of politics is luck. You know, people who think they're like people at school. You know, the people who are incredibly popular and successful at school, you never hear of them again. You know, it's the same really with politics. The people you think are going to be the bright stars end up going nowhere, and it's the plodding, the unlikely that come through. But they all have the determination, and they all have a belief in themselves. And I don't think there's anything wrong with ambition at all. I mean, I think that that's necessary. Often in politics, you have to pretend that you have no ambition. You certainly have to do that in the church. And one of the glories of the Roman Republic, as Gore Vidal once pointed out, is you wanted to be Caesar. There was no pretense. You wanted to have power because having power was fun. There was none of this, you know, I'm doing it for the greater good or any of this. They cut away the hypocrisy completely, which is another reason why they're fascinating to write about.
We have another question in the audience.
John Paul II was an actor as a young man. I think a lot of the cardinals are sort of quite flouncy and dramatic in a way, but anyway, that's me speaking as a Catholic. I just wanted to say thank you for your wonderful novels. Not that everybody is here, but I just think you're marvellous, one of the greatest writers, you know, on the scene.
Well,
and
how kind of you.
I started off with Pompeii, and I love the drama of that. I love all the dramatic ones. And then my husband and I were fighting for the Cicero trilogy, you know, for the next one coming out. And and then of course I bought Conclave. I've only got just a little. I am a, you know, card-carrying Catholic, and I just went at the end. I loved all the sort of stuff in the Sistine Chapel. I mean, just fabulous, sort of real Godfather 3 type stuff, you know, and counting the ballots and all that. That was so exciting. But why did you make him a woman? I mean,
don't say that.
Don't!
Sorry,
Don't give a spoiler.
can't do that.
Goodness.
Nobody
heard that. That'll have to be edited out of the...
Well, you should have brought
I was about to ask you where's the question in this, and now I'm sorry that you got to it.
I had a very nice time with Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, who helped me with the book, who sat in a conclave, and he talked to me. And anyway, then with some trepidation, I sent him the novel, which he really liked, and indeed gave it to the Pope. And he wrote me such a nice letter saying, Cardinal Lamelli is a cardinal such as all we cardinals would like to be. I think you have captured the essence of the conclave perfectly. As to the ending, he said, I just kept telling myself it's only a story.
Well, you didn't bring out the chair.
No.
You poked her into a chair. I thought, well, I'm sorry, I've hogged this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Did you want to ask a question? Yes. We have another one from the audience. I may not get to the rest of my questions. This is excellent.
Why were you drawn to the Dreyfus affair, and how did you respond to the anti-Semitism that you learnt about as you researched that novel?
Well, it was not my idea to do the Dreyfus novel. It was Roman Polanski's. I had made a film with him of my novel, The Ghost, and he wanted to do another thing together and asked if I had an idea, and I did have an idea of a thriller. And then I happened to notice he had a lot of books in his office on the Dreyfus affair. And I said, have you ever thought of doing a film about that? And he said, I've always wanted to do a film about that. And I was originally to be a film script. But I found that once I started researching it, which I approached with a heavy heart, to be honest, because I knew vaguely that it went on for about 12 years with a cast of thousands. And I thought it was archaic, and that after the Holocaust and the Nazis, to go back to French anti-Semitism in the 1890s would be, it would be small beer in comparison to what happened in the 20th century. But when I found this character, Colonel Picard, I saw, as I mentioned earlier, that this was really a novel about a whistleblower, and with universal things to say about power and cover-ups, and of course religious prejudice too. But there was much to the story, and so anyway, I wrote it as a novel, and it was, I think, it's my favourite of the novels, and the only one that at the end of it, I looked at it and I thought, look, how on earth has that happened? Because I started it on January the 15th, 2013. It's 150,000 words long, and it was in the shops in the first week of September. So I've never had anything like that before. For some reason, it was finding the voice, first-person voice, putting it in the present tense, just something at any rate, just unlocked the whole thing. And it was like driving a car through a kind of arcade game. You know, things flew in and out, but at the same time, I followed this, and as my publisher said, all the traffic lights were at green for some reason. It doesn't often happen normally, as now, to be honest. Each day is a struggle. With that book, it never really was. Anyway, that's how the novel came about, and you just, you never know where something's going to come from. And that was just an idea suggested by someone else.
Let me ask you two quick-fire questions just to round out the evening. You've often talked about your admiration for Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene, two writers whose faith very much influenced their work. I'm wondering, is there anyone writing today, the only person who springs to my mind is Marilyn Robinson, who you think is, their faith is also coming through in their literature? Is there anyone equivalent to a Greene or a Waugh?
Well, I don't think... First of all, I'm slightly out of touch with contemporary fiction. I used to read a lot of it. I've sort of slightly given up, mainly because I have to do such a lot of reading for whatever particular book I'm doing. I did read the new Sally Rooney book, and I thought that was full of Catholic imagery and concerns and arguments, and I thought, which I found interesting. I mean, that's a central part of that book, as you know, if you've read it. One of my favourite novelists was Brienne Moore, another Catholic, who was highly rated by Graham Greene, in fact. And I think that, I mean, I love Greene's novels, and I think it is that extra colouring to life, that extra shadowing, that extra dimension of faith applied to everyday life, supernatural, whatever you wish to call it, but something other. And in a sense, that's what novelists, or most of us, are trying to do, find some inner working, something beyond what's plainly in front of your nose. And I think that's why one of the reasons why Catholics do make a very good novelists, because there is always something lurking behind the everyday. As I say in Conclave, everyone is not really, they're not lying, but they're not really saying what's on in their minds. And that slight aiming off in fiction is always very effective.
Okay, and just finally, just to leave us on a note of excitement for the future, what's your elevator pitch for Active Oblivion, which is coming out in September?
Well, it's just I happened to see a line somewhere, I think it was on Twitter, talking about the greatest manhunt of the 17th century. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. So, and it was the hunt for the judges and in particular those who signed the death warrant of Charles I. When Charles II came to the throne, they tried to have a kind of truth and reconciliation with everyone who'd fought the Civil War, except for those who'd had a hand in the murder of the king. And they introduced what was called the Act of Oblivion. And the Act of Oblivion sort of forgave all sins except for those. And so they went after the 20, 30 living regicides. And the hunt went on for 15, 20 years. And there were two in particular who fled to New England, Puritan colonels. Believe me, if you want to try and write a sympathetic novel about two Puritan colonels, you can imagine the difficulties. But it fascinates me. It fascinates me, this idea of them on the run. And what I've invented is a guy kind of in charge of the hunt for the regicides. I mean, there must have been such a figure, but I've created him fictionally, and so he goes after these two. And it's a chase story, really, that goes on for about 15 years. And Yeah, I've written more of it than I normally would have done. I've written probably about a third of it so far.
And that's out in September. All things
Yes.
going to plan.
Deo volente, as they say.
Robert, this has been a pure joy, an absolute pleasure talking to you. It just remains for me to ask everyone in this room to say thank you to you in the only way we can at this distance.
Thank you.